Okay, so in our last video, we saw how we can use JavaScript to actually display things to our HTML page, like kind of write to the HTML page, which allows us to ultimately display in the browser. And it seemed very simple, right? Because all we're doing is using JavaScript here to print something, but how is that different than using an HTML element? Well, the stuff that appears between these script tags is in fact JavaScript, and that includes things like loops and if statements. We can make really advanced and more dynamic code using JavaScript. So it seems minor, but it has huge implications. We're going to pick up from there. And what I want to do next is kind of write this in isolation. Our whole program is trying to do a temperature conversion. So I want to use JavaScript to do the conversion, and then we'll see if we can just change some stuff and kind of retro it so that it displays to HTML as opposed to the console. So the first thing I'm going to do is click my new file icon over here. And my new file is going to be TempConverter.js, right? So we're creating a JavaScript file here. So think about how just using JavaScript, you would go about doing a conversion from a Fahrenheit temperature to a Celsius one. Now, I would like to use user input and blah, blah, blah. That's kind of what we're getting at. Our like short-term / long-term goal here is to get input from the user and make more dynamic programs that way. And with Java, we used Scanner. Scanner doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because we end up using the console, and as we saw in the last video, like displaying back to the console isn't great. So you can imagine trying to read from the console is a bit of a mess. So what we really want to do is use JavaScript the way it was intended and actually use HTML as a way to get input from the user. So I'm just going to kind of create this temperature conversion with just hard-coded variables. Right, so I'm going to create a variable to store my Fahrenheit temperature, and when you're developing or testing, you want to use values that you know. So one that we know is that 212 in Fahrenheit is going to be 100 in Celsius, so that is a good test value to start with. I'm going to then plug in a variable for my Celsius and plug in the Celsius formula, which is 5 ninths times our temperature in Fahrenheit minus 32. Now, you might be thinking that this 5 divided by 9, if you've coded this in some other statically typed language like Java, that truncation occurs. But JavaScript is dynamically typed, and so it's not something you have to worry about. What do we mean with truncation? Well, in Java, this would actually work out to be 0. Right? The division happens, it's 0.555 repeating, but because I got division between two integers, two whole numbers, the result must also be a whole number, so truncation happens where they just chop off that fractional part, and so we end up with 0, and that's a problem because we're multiplying 0 times whatever, we'd get 0 every time. Not a problem here. So we're good. I'm ready to actually display this. I'm going to just log it to the console with console.log. So this should take my 212 and turn it into 100, which we'll see here in our console. I want to run this thing by going to Terminal, New Terminal. It's going to launch my terminal here where this project is located, and I can tell this particular JavaScript file to execute with node TempConverter.js. And there we see our 100. Sweet. Let's try a different temperature real fast. I know that 32 should be 0. So I'm going to save it, I'm going to run it again, and we do get 0. And let's try something wonky like 71 degrees. And we see we get this. So this is looking pretty good. This is a quick conversion. Now the thing is, I'm hard coding these values in, and I'm displaying the console, so we'll want to retro that. This will be eventually user input and then displaying to my HTML page. Okay, so with that in mind, let's pause here in the temp converter. Let's hop back to our index.html. Because the first thing I want to do is kind of bring in this script. Now, I made this in a separate file because in practice, that's what people tend to do, right? This is only 3 lines of code. right? I could essentially plug in those 3 lines here and embed them directly. But as these files get larger and larger and larger, right, embedding that code into my HTML starts to become a mess. Also, we kind of get to like section things off, right? I get to keep my JavaScript in a JavaScript file. I get to keep my HTML in an HTML file. So first thing I'm going to do is get rid of this. What I'm actually going to do is kind of cut it from here, right? I'm going to cut it in Windows as Control X. So that's not only going to delete it, but it's going to copy it, and I'm going to throw it into my JavaScript file as a comment. We're going to refer back to this later. This will be important later. Okay. Now that that's gone from my HTML, what I want is my JavaScript code that's in the separate file to make a presence here. And what people typically do in practice, instead of just writing the code here, just embedding it directly into the HTML, they effectively import it by taking the script tag and saying that the source is going to be TempConverter.js. Okay, so what I am basically doing is importing it. I hope you remember import statements or have encountered import statements before, but this is basically just gaining access to this TempConverter.js. We're saying that this file is part of our HTML as well. Okay, so we've got that going. What I need to do is be able to basically pull some type of input information. Okay, so much like I've made an output, I need to make a section for my input. And what we're going to want is an input text box. So I'm going to kind of use a paragraph tag to keep these things together because we're going to do multiple things here. Right? I would maybe say something like Fahrenheit. I'm spelling this right, yeah. Fahrenheit. And then we're going to have like a text box where the user could actually input their text. So let's throw that in. And there's already existing HTML code to create this element. I'm going to create an input. And my input type is going to be text. Okay. Why don't we see what changes have occurred there? I put this in a paragraph tag because there's going to be more underneath, and I want to keep those things grouped together using a paragraph tag. But let's just see what this has done. I'm going to run my HTML file, and my favorite way to run it is to right-click, Reveal in File Explorer, and then double-click on it to launch it. Now it's going to run it in Chrome, and this is what we got so far. Right, we have our header, which was done by that H1 tag, the Fahrenheit, which I typed in, and then here's a text box which I could type things into. Okay. And the high was ultimately from this little paragraph tag here. Okay, so that gives me a text box. Sweet. There's a place for the user to input their text. Once they have inputted, they've put their number into our system, we need a way to tell them to finally execute, and that's where our button comes in. So also here, right, I'm actually kind of grouping this in how I expect it to look. We're going to have Fahrenheit. We're going to have a text box. I'm then going to have my button. And that is why don't we put it on the next line? We're going to basically label the button. Whatever text you put in between this opening button tag and this closing button tag will actually appear on the button itself. So why don't we see that change? I'm going to flip over to my code, my index.html. Inside the browser, I'm going to refresh it, and there we see our convert button. Right, we have our text where they can put this, and they can click the convert button. Right now, it doesn't do anything. What we need to add to this is an on-click event. Okay, we need to tell it that whenever this button is clicked, do something. And the something that I want it to do is execute this code, right? I can't really tell it to execute the entirety of the program. What I can tell it to do is execute a function or a method. So what I'm going to do here is that this process of converting, I'm going to grab these 3 lines, I'm going to tab them over, and then I'm going to actually create a JavaScript function. They're pretty simple relative to some other languages such as Java, largely because JavaScript is dynamically typed. I'm going to create a function called convert. And then we're going to have some parentheses. I'm going to include some braces around my code here to say that all 3 of these lines are part of this function called convert. Now, let's think about this for a moment. We have a keyword, function, letting JavaScript know that I want this to be a function. The name of this function is called convert. It doesn't take in any parameters, any arguments, right? No inputs coming in. And if this were Java, we would have a return type. But because this is a dynamically typed language, you don't have to specify a return type. I'm not returning anything anyway. Here we are. So I basically am just tagging this section of code with convert, which means if I really want to refer to this, which I do, I can just call it by calling the convert function. And that's actually what we're going to do on click. On click, I want it to execute the convert function. Okay, we're able to find convert because we effectively imported TempConverter.js. Okay, let's try this out. Okay, you may be thinking, nothing's going to happen. I'm going to refresh my page so we got the most updated code. I'm going to convert 212 Fahrenheit. Convert. Convert. Nothing's happening except something is happening, right? We are converting and we're actually logging this to the console. Recall, we can get to the console by right-clicking and inspecting. And there's our console there. Why am I getting 21? When I'm entering 212, shouldn't I be getting 100? Well, our code right now is just working off this hard-coded value. So what I want is this input. Right? We created this neat little text box here where the user can type something. I need to pull that into my code here. So what we need to do is actually tag this. In the same way that I tagged my output, right? I need to give my input box, right? This is the text box. I need to give it an ID. And the ID I'm going to give it is just simply input. Right? We got an input, we got an output. Okay. Well, with that, I can now refer to it. The fact that it has a name, I can refer to it. I'm going to hop back to my JavaScript code. And the syntax is going to be kind of similar to this, where we go document dot get element by ID. In this case, I'm pulling from that text box, which we just tagged with input. And what I want from that text box is the value. Just value. Okay, so we're going into our HTML document. We're getting an element by ID input. That's this guy, this text box here. And I'm going to pull out the value. This is not a method call. We're just pulling out that value. I'm going to rerun my code here. We're going to do 212. I'm going to hit convert, which is going to tell that convert to execute. And notice we're getting 100 now, the correct temperature, which means that this 212 is getting into my code, right? The user's input. We're approaching our final step here, which is instead of logging it to the console, what I want is for it to show up here in the actual browser. And that's where this code comes back, right? We're going to edit our document. You can copy and paste if you want, but I like the repetitious practice here. We're going to do document.getElement by ID. We're going to pull output, and we want to change the inner HTML to be our Celsius temperature. I'm going to save that. And I'm going to run it. All right, let's refresh our page. I'm going to do 212. Tell it to convert. And notice we're not getting the 100 in the console. That's good. We didn't tell it to log to the console, and we are getting it into our web page. That's pretty sweet. Okay. What I would consider at this point is kind of just cleaning it up, right? Adding stuff to our page to make it a little bit better for users. And one thing I recommend is, instead of saying hi, why don't we say Celsius, indicating that we expect a Celsius temperature to go there. Why don't we see that change? Right? This is what it looks like initially before we run anything. However, if I were to enter my 212 temperature, we're replacing that Celsius with 100. That's because here in our code, right, we're saying that whatever is there becomes Celsius. I kind of want to keep this text, right? I want to say Celsius colon and then the actual temperature. So why don't we change the inner HTML to be Celsius colon plus that Celsius temperature. I'm going to save this. And then let's refresh our page, right? So it says Celsius. I do 212, and that then becomes Celsius 100. Now, you might be thinking, well, why didn't you do the plus equals operator there, right? Why don't we just keep the Celsius that's there, right? Because when you initially load the page, there's a Celsius. Why don't we keep that, and then instead of replacing it with Celsius 100, we just tack on 100, or whatever the temperature is. Well, let's try that. I'm going to do my 212 conversion. Okay, that looks perfectly fine. That seems to work. However, if I continue to do temperature conversions here, right, I want to change 99 Fahrenheit. Oh. We're literally just, we keep what's there and we keep adding to it. Right, so that's not quite what we want, which is why we're going this route where we're saying that the element becomes this. Okay. Final things I would probably consider doing is adding, like underneath our welcome text, an explanation. This program or page or whatever you want to call it converts a temperature from Fahrenheit to Celsius. Something like that. And this is actually simple enough, not a lot of lines, that I would just maybe put it all in one line. Let's give it one last go. Welcome to TempConverter. This program converts a temperature from Fahrenheit to Celsius. We have our input box. Let's go over 9,000, and we get that. Okay, I know this page doesn't look pretty. You want to spice it up. You want to throw some images on there. But, I mean, that starts getting into cascading style sheets known as CSS. And people take entire courses on CSS. And for most web developers, CSS is a nightmare. We could spend all day trying to edit this, make it look pretty. It is functional at the moment. You may be thinking this is simple, but one of the things I like the most about it is we have just these two files. I can take these two files, I could put them on an actual web page online, and anyone in the world could access them. I could send people these two files, and they could execute our program in their web browser, right? If this was Java, we gotta extract it to a jar file to make something that's executable for people to use, or they could have the Java development kit on their computer and run it in an IDE environment. No, it's just here's the files. Do you have a web browser? Boom. You can use my little web page. So yeah, this is yeah.